Good evening. And on behalf of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, welcome to tonight's edition of the Dan Schnur Political Report. There's a lot going on in the world and in our country, and I know you're all looking forward to Dan's analysis to help us work our way through this. But before we get there, I do want to let some of you know, by the way, I'm Richard Downey, the President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. But in the past few weeks, we've had some really great events that I think we have some videos, some YouTube videos that I think you'll find interesting. One of them was with Fiona Hill, whom you'll remember was the national security official for Russia and Europe during President Trump's last term. And we had a great event with her, phenomenal. On the 27th of February, we talked about the negotiations with Ukraine and Russia, as well as relationships with Europe, the U.S. relationship with Europe. And I think you'll find that is interesting, as well as a video we just put up with Police Chief Jim McDonnell, talking about policing strategies for a safer Los Angeles. The last one I want to highlight was one that Dan Schnur moderated on Tuesday night. It was a wonderful event about the role of Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel and sort of pros and cons, lots of views. We didn't actually record that, but we did record the audio of it. So we're going to be putting out some takeaways from that event that I think you'll want to hear and see, because it was just a wonderful event. We want you to be a part of the conversation tonight with Dan, of course. And there's at any time during this session, there'll be about 30 minutes of Dan answering questions. But anytime you can go down to the bottom of your screen on the Q&A button there and ask a question. And Madison Alt, who'll be our host for the session tonight, will take that and ask that question after the initial portion. So, by the way, if you are not a member of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, please become one. We don't charge for these webinars, and there are operational costs we have to incur and do for this. So we appreciate your support. If you've donated in the last few months, thank you very much. It's much appreciated and much needed. And by the way, if any of you are willing to be a sponsor for any of these monthly Dan Schnur Political Reports for $500, I promise I will not beg you for donations. So there's that incentive, but we really do value your donations. And all you need to do is go in the chat. There'll be a link to make a donation, or you can do it on the website. It's easy to do. And that's how we support getting information to you about what's going on in the world and how it affects you. So without any further ado, let me pass it over to Dan Schnur, who will provide his analysis for tonight. Dan, please. Thank you very much.
Richard, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you, as always, for joining us for these conversations. It's interesting because last Friday morning, when Maddie and Krista and I were scheduled to plan out today's webinar, we knew that because President Trump was scheduled to give his first speech of this term to a joint session of Congress on Tuesday night, we knew that logically that would and should be the focus of tonight's discussion. Well, that was before Volodymyr Zelensky arrived at the White House. That was before what seemed to be a fairly straightforward meeting between him and Trump turned into a verbal brawl. That's before Zelensky was, for all practical purposes, thrown out of the White House. So by the time he left, we had realized that we needed to regroup. And so over the last few days, we've redone this to obviously talk about what we believe, and I think you would agree, is the most significant news of the week. We will talk about Trump's speech a little bit later in the first half hour of this program before we go to my favorite part, which is questions from all of you. But we did want to start out, of course, by talking about that remarkable confrontation between the two presidents in the White House on Friday morning. I think the first thing to know, the first thing to keep in mind, is that scene in the Oval Office, where two world leaders disagreed that vehemently and almost violently, was not really that unusual. World leaders have those kind of conversations all the time, but they almost always happen in private. They happen behind closed doors. And the way these events are normally set up is there's a very brief photo opportunity in which the two leaders pose together. They take a couple of perfunctory questions. Then they do the real work in private. And that's exactly what was scheduled to happen last Friday, at which point Trump and Zelensky were going to reemerge, sign an agreement that had been previously settled between the two countries, giving the United States access to much of Ukraine's rare metals and rare minerals supply. And then they would have lunch together. So that was the plan. But, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but both Zelensky and Trump wanted more than a photo opportunity on Friday, and for very different reasons. Both of them wanted a platform in front of the news media and ultimately a global audience. And we'll get into the details of that a little bit later. But what that allowed for is a conversation and a confrontation that, under most circumstances, would have taken place in private to happen in a very, very public and a much more damaging way. So we'll talk going forward today about what happened in that meeting. We'll talk about why it happened. We'll talk about what comes next and what it means for both the Ukraine-Russia war, but also what it means in terms of long-term questions for the US-Europe relationship, which seems to be undergoing its most dramatic transformation in roughly 80 years, and what it means for the US role in global affairs going forward even more broadly than that. So lots to cover today, Maddie. Should we jump in?
I think we should. And I do want to kick it off. Like you said, this sort of thing doesn't usually happen in public. And since it was really such a public blow up, I guess I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself here, but I'm wondering, do you think that the US Ukraine relationship can be repaired?
No, I don't think you're getting ahead of us at all. To me, that's the most logical place to take the conversation going forward. And the short answer is I think the relationship can be repaired and think it will be repaired. Both Trump and Zelensky have a very strong incentive to move past last week's fireworks. And that is more challenging because they happened in public, but they both needed to happen. It's worth remembering that during the campaign last year, Trump promised regularly to end this war. And that would be a lot harder to do going forward without Ukraine's active cooperation and involvement. And while Zelensky, in the moment, and there's been much debate about whether he should have pushed back against Vance as hard as he did, but while Zelensky felt in that moment he needed to stand up to Trump and Vance, not just on his own behalf, but on behalf of his country, the type of conciliatory public statements he's been making over the last several days suggests that Zelensky recognizes he can't afford to allow the United States to align itself even more fully with Russia. So they're already working on finishing the deal on the rare minerals that Zelensky had come to sign on Friday. And that's something that ought to be done in the next matter of days. And while Zelensky and Trump personally do not like each other, getting that rare minerals agreement signed really is the first step to putting the broader relationship back together. But I would also say this. Over the last couple of days, as I know all of you know, the United States has now suspended military aid to Ukraine, and even more importantly, suspended its intelligence sharing capacity. And the question is what concessions Trump is going to want from Zelensky on the broader peace agreement in exchange for restoring that support. In other words, as I said a moment ago, Trump needs this war to end. He promised that to the American people. And because he does seem to be struggling to keep his promise on inflation, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that in the question and answer, he has to get this war over with. So what he's doing is he's putting the pressure, he's putting the squeeze on Zelensky and says, even if you don't want to make the kind of concessions I think you need to, I'm going to try to force you into it by withholding the various types of support that the US has provided to Ukraine over the last 3 years. Now, Zelensky is in a really difficult position here because on one hand, he and his country really do need that US support. Now, the European nations, the European Union -1, 26 of the 27 countries minus Hungary, the European nations are going to try to backfill a lot of that military aid for Ukraine. Right now, the United States provides about 20% of Ukraine's military capacity. And it is entirely possible, given Ukraine's own enhanced production abilities and given what Europe's leading countries are talking about doing now, it's possible at least that maybe not immediately, but over a period of months, that Europe can backfill most, if not all, of that aid. What's more challenging for Ukraine is the intelligence capability that the US has provided them, because that has allowed them to make the forays they have in terms of their own Russian incursions. And even more importantly, it's provided protection for them in terms of an early warning system to protect the cities of Ukraine against Russian missiles. So anyway, Europe's going to try to provide a lot of that military aid. But Zelensky's going to have to decide whether the concessions that Trump wants are something that he can swallow, or whether he can try to rely solely on Europe and other allies for the support his country needs. Either way, though, while this relationship is never going to be a strong one, at least in the foreseeable future, these two leaders, like I said, even if they don't like each other, they need each other. So already we're beginning to see this relationship gradually heading at least somewhat back in the right direction. And I think, Krista, if I can ask you to step in, that's going to lead to our first question for all of you. Since I asked Maddie's first question, let me ask all of you. Do you think the US and Ukraine will agree to a deal on precious metals, on these minerals that are so vital for all sorts of high-tech related reasons? Obviously, this agreement was going to be signed last Friday. It did seem to fall apart. As I mentioned a moment ago, these negotiations and this agreement does seem to be back on track, but nothing is for sure. So we want to ask all of you, which of these 5 options you think make the most sense? Number 1, do you think the agreement will be back on track, but on more favorable terms for the US than it would have been last Friday? Yes, you think they'll agree to the deal, but on more favorable terms for Ukraine. Yes, they will agree, but essentially to the same agreement that Zelensky and Trump were prepared to sign before their meeting exploded. Or D, there'll be no agreement at all as a result of that blowup. And finally, we always try to offer you a don't know option. So, Krista, what did our group think about this? What do you think is going to happen going forward? Really interesting. 53%, more than half of our group, believes that the agreement will take place, but on more favorable terms for the US, and I think that's probably right. But if you add that to the 14% of you who believe there'll be an agreement, but on better terms for Ukraine, and the 21% of you who say the agreement will be signed without any change whatsoever, wow, that means that almost, not quite, almost 90% of our group believes that that agreement will be signed in the foreseeable future, which means that at least to some degree, most of us do believe that the two countries' relationship will be back on track, maybe under somewhat different circumstances, even after the altercation last Friday. Really interesting. Before I go on any further, Krista, let's put up a second question, because we want to ask you right away, beyond that rare metals agreement, I want to ask you a broader question. Let's say there's a peace agreement, and it looks now like there will be European troops in between Ukraine and Russia if that peace agreement takes place. During the negotiations over the rare minerals, Zelensky repeatedly pressed for security guarantees. The idea that the European troops were not able to withstand a Russian push. Would the US offer support? And Trump was somewhat resistant of that. He said that if we're mining, if we're engaged in business activities in your country, Russia would not attack. The leaders of France and Germany and England are all working very hard to convince Trump that the US should play at least a supportive role beyond Europe on the front lines if this should all happen. So again, question for all of you. What do you think would happen under that circumstance if Russia were to violate a peace agreement? Do you think that with Russia moving further into Ukraine, that the US would offer military backup to European troops? Do you think the US would engage, but with economic support rather than military support? Or do you think there'd be no US support whatsoever? And based on what we've seen over the last, not just few days, but the last several weeks, that the US would stand back and let Ukraine and Europe handle this the best they could? So, Krista, what did we get from our group for this one? Also very interesting. Look at those numbers. Only 15% of our group thinks that the US would provide military support, even in a backup capacity, to European troops on the front line. 44% believe that the US would help to some degree, but economically. 34%, more than a third of our group, says there'd be no US support whatsoever. And these are the questions that European leaders are wrestling with right now. And when we talk a little bit later about the broader questions about the future of the US-Europe relationship, this is exactly the kind of thing that we want to get into. Maddie, I know you and I talked a little bit last Friday in our prep call about the distinct difference between a public and a private confrontation, right?
Yeah, we did. And you brought it up earlier and you made a great point about how this sort of conversation does happen all the time in private. But I'm wondering, essentially, how did this happen in public? What factors led to that?
Well, as I said earlier, both Zelensky and Trump and his advisors saw a benefit for a more prolonged public comment section. Again, the way this had been handled in many other similar situations with Trump and his predecessors was a fairly straightforward photo opportunity and a couple perfunctory questions before they got to work behind closed doors. But both Trump and Zelensky were very aware that they would have a global audience. Zelensky needed that audience very badly because he recognizes that after being greeted as a hero here in the US and around the world 3 years ago, after Russia first invaded Ukraine, Zelensky was very aware that support for Ukraine and for him in this country and elsewhere had dropped significantly. And so I think ultimately Zelensky realized that if he was going to move a large number of Americans or worldwide viewers, he needed more than a photo opportunity to make his case on why support for Ukraine to protect Europe against Russia was so important. Trump and his advisors in the White House came to the same conclusion. They know that while Trump's base is somewhat suspicious of and somewhat critical of Ukraine, there's a lot of voters in this country who do still believe that the US ought to be supporting Ukraine, and who harbor real suspicions toward Russia. So both presidents wanted a chance to make their case. So both sides agreed to a prolonged exchange with reporters. And as we can talk about a little bit going forward, because I know you have other questions on this topic, because that public session went on so long, Vice President Vance saw an opportunity.
Yeah, and I actually am wondering about this, and I don't want to sound like I'm being a little bit conspiracy forward, but do you think that Trump and Vance planned this confrontation in advance? I mean, it sort of seemed like maybe that was an option. I'm not sure. What do you think?
I don't think that the two of them planned it in advance. Because if you watched the entire public session, for the first 22, 23 minutes, it was very clear that Zelensky and Trump didn't like each other, but they were both behaving fairly respectfully. I think they both recognized they were going to have to endure this, and then they could have a private disagreement, and then they would sign that mineral rights agreement that we talked about earlier, and then somehow make it through a lunch together. So neither one of them was all that enthusiastic, but both of them seemed pretty docile. And to me, what happened at that point is, well, first of all, even before we talk about Vance's involvement, it's worth noting that Vance has been a leader of the more isolationist-leaning wing of the Republican Party. And he's been a very pronounced Ukraine skeptic ever since he first ran for US Senate in 2022. And he's seen by a lot of MAGA conservatives, understandably as the vice president, as the potential heir to Trump's legacy. And Vance, recognizes that there's a growing strain of nationalism in this country. And he also sees the benefits to be drawn for him in positioning himself as the leading voice of a more nationalist isolationist movement. He talked about this when he was in Europe at the Munich Security Conference a few weeks ago. And so in this very high-profile encounter, I believe that the vice president used Zelensky's response to a reporter about Putin. The vice president saw that question to Zelensky about Putin as an opportunity to not only harshly criticize Zelensky, but I think he did so in a way that seemed very specifically designed to provoke Trump too. If you think about what Vance said, he didn't just say that Zelensky was wrong. He disparaged him for being disrespectful, for coming to the White House and disrespecting the President of the United States. And then he challenged Zelensky for never having expressed gratitude properly to the president. And Trump has a thin skin. So my own opinion is that while this was not planned between Vance and Trump, that Vance knew exactly what he was doing, and that he would provoke both Zelensky and Trump, both presidents, into the kind of confrontation that ultimately took place. So, I mean, if you think about it, Maddie, look, both of them, for very different reasons, both Zelensky and Trump, both of them have pretty healthy egos. They both become very accustomed to being treated very deferentially by the people around them. Neither one of them likes being questioned or challenged. Neither one of them responds very well to being provoked. Both of them do have thin skins and short tempers. And I think Vance knew this. And he played the two presidents against each other, knowing that that explosion could even temporarily derail the progress that Ukraine and the US were making and cause an even bigger challenge for the United States relationship with Europe going forward. So, long answer, but it's an important question. I don't think that the president and vice president planned it. I think Vance saw an opportunity and leapt on it and was able to advance his cause by the way he helped steer the conversation.
All right. I can't say that I was expecting one answer or the other from you, but that's a really interesting take on it.
So now the other question here is I think that Vance was intentionally lighting a fire under both Trump and Zelensky.
Mm.
I guess the logical question, Krista, if we can put it up for our group, is we understand why Trump responded the way he did. But the question, if we can, Krista, is should Zelensky have been less confrontational to Trump? In other words, should Zelensky resist the debate? Because before he came to the White House, Zelensky met that morning with a bipartisan group of US senators, Republicans and Democrats, all of whom told him, don't take the bait. Don't get into a fight with Trump. Look at the way the French and the British leaders handled their meetings with the president earlier in the week. They were very deferential. Swallow your pride a little bit, they told him, and you're much more likely to get out of that meeting with what you need. Now, Zelensky obviously chose not to do that. And as I mentioned earlier, I think he was not only felt he needed to stand up for himself, but for his country to see him standing up for all of them too. So question for all of you, should Zelensky have been less confrontational to Trump when that pivotal moment occurred? Option one, yes, he should have been less confrontational. He needs the US support, and this got him into trouble that wasn't necessary. Two, now he needed to stand up, not just for himself, but for the people of his country, and to have his constituents see him standing up for them. Or third, no, this was no good option. This was a lose-lose from the beginning. What do we think, Krista? What did we get from our group? Wow, I would not have expected that response, but it's a very close division. It's almost a three-way split, if you notice. 38% of you, a little bit more than a third, say that Zelensky did not make a mistake, that he needed to stand up for himself and his country. 30%, on the other hand, a little bit less than a third, said, nope, he should have swallowed his pride, he needs the US support. And 32%, also a little bit less than a third, said there was no good answer to this puzzle. So almost a precise even split between our group. I find that very interesting. Krista, I told them, I told our group what I thought about whether Trump and Vance planned that confrontation in advance. But what do you say we ask them? So right away, we're going to come to all of you. What do you think? Do you believe that Trump and Vance did plan this out, that they were setting Zelensky up for a fight? Do you think that they lost their tempers and they tossed and decided to push back? And as you could tell, I picked an answer sort of in between those two. So I'm going to somewhat unfairly force all of you into actually a very unfair binary choice. But given the choices that we've given you, unfairly or not, let's see what our group has to say. What do we got, Krista? Also interesting, also a fairly even split. 49% of our group do think that Trump and Vance set it up in advance. And 41%, a little bit less, but not that much of a difference, thought that it happened in the moment, that Vance legitimately lost his temper, and of course, Trump did too. Very interesting. So, Maddie, we've talked about the Trump and Zelensky meeting for a good portion of the last half an hour, but I did tell the group that we were going to talk at least a little bit before we went to their questions about the president's speech to the joint session of Congress. Now, as all of you know, of course, this is not a State of the Union address, because when a new president takes office, he or someday she deliver an inaugural address, which Donald Trump did, of course, on January 20th. And so the speech to a joint session of Congress is technically not considered a State of the Union when it's given the same year as an inauguration. But it was without any doubt, regardless of whether you're a fan or a foe of Trump's, it was without a doubt the longest presidential speech to a joint session of Congress ever. And we were talking about this right before we came on the air today. Krista and Maddie and I agreed that it is an all-time record, at least until next year's State of the Union speech, and then we'll see what happens. And it's also notable that how contentious both Trump's speech and the Democratic response were.
Yeah.
One other thing I'll mention just quickly, and then I'm eager to hear your thoughts because we really want to get to your questions. The other thing that really struck me, not from the president's speech itself, but from the Democratic response, was their selection of Senator Alyssa Slotkin from Michigan to give the official response. Slotkin had been a member of the House of Representatives until she was elected to the Senate in November, so she's a newly elected senator. She's considered to be a member of the more centrist, more hawkish wing of the Democratic caucus. And so it was instructive that the Democratic leadership picked her as someone to respond from the Democratic center rather than from the party's base. And we'll talk more about this going forward. But what I'd like to do before now that we can dig into the substance of Trump's speech a little bit, is, Krista, if we can put up our next question. I'm looking forward to getting all of your thoughts on this. From a policy standpoint, what do you think was the most important thing that Trump talked about during his speech? Was it foreign policy, Ukraine, Gaza, elsewhere? Was it economic policy, taxes, budget, tariffs, and inflation? Was it border or immigration issues? Or was it the Elon Musk so-called Doge program, the government spending cuts, or something else, a topic other than those four? And let's see what we got there, and then I'll dig in a little bit further. Well, look, we have a tie here. 36% of our group, just a little bit over 1/3, 36% said that economic policy was the most important thing that Trump talked about. 36% said that the DOGE work and government spending was the most important thing. Interesting, only 10% said foreign policy, Ukraine and Gaza. And I have to tell you, Maddie, my own thought is that, and I don't say this either as a supporter or opponent of Trump, just as an observer, it wasn't a speech that was very heavy on news. Usually presidents tend to use State of the Union addresses or speeches to joint sessions of Congress to forward a series of policy proposals. But almost everything that we heard from Trump on Tuesday night were things we'd heard from him before. Some observers, some meant it as a compliment, some as a criticism, said it seemed like a campaign rally speech more than anything else. And whether you agree with that categorization, there was not much new in terms of policy substance in the speech. The one thing that I picked up is he did talk briefly about how he felt Zelensky was moving toward a new agreement with the United States, as we were discussing earlier.
Mhm.
So as news goes, that's probably the closest thing to it. And what that meant is that most of the news coverage, as a result, ended up being not about the content of the speech and the response, but rather about the tone of it and how confrontational Trump was and how equally confrontational Democrats were in response. And I know once we shift in a couple minutes to the Q&A portion, some of you may want to ask some questions about the policy discussed in the speech. But at least for me, I thought the major takeaway was one more of tone than of content. And so we'll go to your questions in just a minute. But Maddie, I know you had something else on your mind you wanted to raise before we shifted into the second stage of the program.
Well, I did have two questions. One I'll save until the end if you could get me, but I was wondering, I know we were talking more about tone than content, but did you have one topic that you thought was the most important thing that he discussed?
Well, I think because it was news, I would say his reference to Zelensky and Ukraine was probably the most important part of the speech. I'm not quarreling with our group
Mhm.
because even though he didn't say anything new about the economy, even though he didn't say anything new about DOGE, those are obviously clearly important topics to the American people. If anything, I would say is it was notable how little Trump said about inflation. He did talk about tariffs, and I guess he did make some news on that by warning voters that there might be some discomfort coming as tariffs were implemented. So that is newsworthy and that is important. That said, I would have expected that for a president who ran for office promising to bring prices back under control, that we would have heard more on that topic from him in the speech, and we did not.
Well, thank you for that. And I will get my one last question in before we go over to our audience. And it's because you promised to answer it for me. Dan, what is a Skutnik?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question, Maddie. I'm glad you asked, and I'm really glad that you reminded me. So, as all of you who watched the speech probably noticed, there were several times during the president's address when he called out people in the audience, everyday citizens who, for some reason or another, had accomplished or experienced something extraordinary, and talked about what they had done and gave a chance for the members of Congress in the audience to applaud them. And as you probably also saw, many members of Congress brought guests with them to the speech, also attempting to highlight uh, policy issues that were important to them. So a lot of Democrats brought newly laid off government workers with them, particularly veterans. Trump pointed to the families of two young women who had been killed at the hands of individuals who were in this country without documentation. So both the president and Congress used these individuals as a way of putting a human face on their uh, on their policy points. And those people, in political parlance, are known as Skutniks. And the reason for that is as follows. For those of you with long memories, you may remember that back in Ronald Reagan's first term in office, shortly before his State of the Union address, there's a horrible airplane tragedy in which a passenger jet, crashed into the 14th Street Bridge, which connects the District of Columbia to Virginia. And in the aftermath of that horrible plane crash, there were survivors. And on the shores of the Potomac River, a young man saw people flailing around in the very icy waters because it was January. It's obviously very, very cold. This young man jumped into the Potomac, swam out, rescued a young woman, and brought her to safety. Now, the really, really nice part of the story is that young man and that young woman ended up getting married. Now, a few years later, they got divorced, which is where the story sort of falls apart. But that young man's name was Lenny Skutnik. And so shortly afterwards, Ronald Reagan's advisors invited Mr. Skutnik to come to the State of the Union speech. And what Ronald Reagan did, which had never been done before, and it's now done by presidents, by governors, by mayors, and State of the Unions, and State of the States, and State of the City speeches, it's become very commonplace. But Ronald Reagan and Lenny Skutnik pioneered this technique. So if you were wondering at all why Donald Trump kept pointing to people in the audience and why members of Congress were bringing these guests with them, well, it's because of Ronald Reagan and Lenny Skutnik. So Maddie, that's what a Skutnik is.
Wow. Thank you so much for answering that. I was wondering, and I feel like, I always feel like I get to leave these having learned something, but this is definitely one that I'll be repeating.
Probably a little bit less useful than any of the things you learned, but we'll stick with it. Maybe we should see if our group has more substantive questions than the one I just did.
All right, let's switch on over to our Q&A then, and I've got our questions up right here. Let's see. All right, do you want to start really strong? Is that the energy we're going for tonight? Okay. Someone's saying, how can the average person join together and resist the Trump attack on democracy? I know we try to keep it nonpartisan. It's a pretty bold question at the gate, but I'm wondering what you think.
It is a bold question, but to be fair, it's a question that many of the people in this country who did not vote for Donald Trump are asking. And I feel like have not spoken to the audience member about it particularly, but I think a lot of these questions are coming in out of some frustration, not just frustration because of disagreements with the president, both his actions and his conduct, but also frustration with what many loyal Democrats see as an inability of their party's leaders to push back effectively against Trump. And so I'll offer two answers. One, I'll actually answer the question. The people I know who are most committed to an alternative to Donald Trump have decided, at least for now, not all, but most, to focus their attentions for the time being between now and next year's midterm elections, not on national politics, but rather on community-based organizations, volunteer groups, and other ways to help people who they feel are being unfairly impacted by Trump's policies. And the midterm elections, and of course the next presidential election in 2028, is a more definitive and far-reaching way of weighing in. But a lot of the people I know who did not support Trump in 2024 or previously are looking at that kind of local and community-based effort as a way of helping individuals, as opposed to a more traditional partisan political involvement, at least until the midterms heat up next year. The thing I would say is this, since we're on the topic, is there are a lot of voters who are frustrated with Trump. His poll numbers are better than they were for much of his first term, but still very low compared to presidents throughout history at this early stage of what should be a honeymoon period in their terms. But there seems to be fairly common agreement that Democrats are having a great deal of difficulty figuring out how to respond to him. And I don't want to change the subject because the question was about Trump, but I do want to come back to where I started, that I do believe that question and questions like it are based in frustration, both toward Trump and toward the opposition. And maybe over the next 20 minutes or so, we'll have another question that allows us to talk more about what the Democrats could or should be doing in addition to what they've been attempting.
Thank you so much. All right. This is actually, we're going to keep in the same vein talking about the Democratic Party. And it's asking, what should the Democratic Party focus on to prepare for the 2026 midterms and the 2028 presidential election, in your experience?
I think that one of the challenges the Democrats are facing right now is because Trump is making news and making policy on so many fronts so quickly that they're having a difficult time trying to figure out how to respond and what to respond to. Now, one of the lessons that I learned back when I was working in politics all those years ago is that the more messages you have, the less impactful any of them are. And so I think one of the difficulties that the Democrats are running into now is because they're trying to respond to Trump on so many fronts, um, on jobs, on taxes, on inflation, on Doge, on tariffs, on Ukraine, on Gaza, and on so many other issues, that none of those messages are really penetrating because they're almost competing against each other for the voters' attention. And so what I think is necessary, and this is something that can't happen in its entirety until the party picks its next presidential nominee in the summer of 2028. But between now and then, I think the party leaders have to work even harder to instill discipline among their members to agree on what that point of rebuttal should be. Now, the challenge the Democrats face is, of course, like most political parties, they're a collection of many different interest groups with many different priorities. And if they were to pick a particular issue, say tariffs, well, you'd have a lot of loyal Democrats who'd be furious that they weren't emphasizing border policy or climate change or other issues that are important to a lot of voters who do not support Trump's election. I'll give you just one small example and then we'll go on. On Tuesday night, as many of you saw, the Democrats chose to push back visually in a few different ways. Many of their members wore pink as protest. Many of them carried small signs with them, but even those signs had very different, many different messages on them. And one member, of course, was for the first time, I believe in congressional history, forced to leave the chamber because of his verbal confrontation with the president. But I'll tell you what I would have done for visuals if it had been me, and of course it wasn't. If I were the Democratic leaders, I would have given every single member of both the Senate and House caucuses, I would have given them an egg and said at certain points in the speech, and we'll signal you when to do it, we want every Democrat in the audience to hold up an egg. And given that Trump spends so little of his speech talking about inflation, and given that it's an issue along with border policy that arguably steered the election for him back in November, I believe that something like that would have fundamentally altered the news coverage of the speech into questions about why Trump had not been talking more about this critical issue of inflation that so concerns voters. Polls show that even while Trump's favorability and job approval numbers are holding up fairly well, not great, but fairly well, even those many of those voters who support him do not think he's doing nearly enough to bring down prices. And again, there's plenty of smart Democrats who would argue that that is the wrong issue to emphasize. But whatever issue they chose, you choose one issue, not many, and you put everything you have behind it. So, one man's thought.
I actually quite like that idea. They should take you on. But I actually want to keep this in the same vein. There's quite a few questions, and we're kind of condensing them down into one, which is asking whether or not you think that there will be a fair election, as we have known in the past, in 2028.
I do. And I think one of the things that we saw in 2020, despite all of the violence and despite all of the other unpleasantness and ugliness, is we saw ultimately that despite Trump's and his allies' numerous challenges, ultimately the system held. I think what we're already seeing now is that even though Republicans also control the Congress, albeit by very small margins, that the courts, not on every issue, are pushing back at some administration actions that they think to be excessive or unconstitutional. And so if you do look back at 2020 and 2021, we did see the courts, we did see state legislatures, we did see elected officials, both Democrat and Republican, pushing back against erroneous charges in an unfair election. So I do believe that given that fairly recent evidence, that regardless of the outcome, whether the majority of the people on this call happen to agree with it or not, I do believe ultimately that we'll see the system hold again. Does that guarantee that it will? Of course, history doesn't guarantee the future, but at least for me, it provides a reassurance that we've seen how similar challenges have been addressed in the past. And I am optimistic enough to think that can happen again going forward.
Thank you so much. All right, we're going to switch topics here because I have a lot of questions relating to last Friday's blow up and Ukraine in general. So our first one here is asking, it's a long one, there's some context, but I think it's important. It says, today Trump suggested that the US would not necessarily feel bound by NATO's Article 5, cornerstone of the alliance, that states an armed attack against one member is an armed attack against all, obligating other members to assist the attack party. Do you think that he would seriously withhold US support, and what do you think this might mean for Taiwan?
All sorts of good questions there. And for those of you who have not followed this particular aspect of the debate closely, as the questioner indicated, just today, Trump indicated that he thought there should be sort of a graduated level or a level of NATO financial involvement and therefore armed support. And what Trump's suggestion is if a NATO member does not commit a certain proportion of its budget to defense, that therefore the US might not be obligated to defend them. Now, as Maddie mentioned, of course, Article 5 of the NATO charter, makes it very clear that an attack on any NATO country is an attack on all, and that obligates all NATO countries to respond. Now, I do think it's an open question that whether it's President Trump or President Biden or another, is the challenge for a United States president to rally the people of this country to go to war on behalf of, well, of a smaller European country that not many people in this country know very much about, would be a tremendous political undertaking. So even without Trump wondering out loud here, I think that Article 5 might create a challenge for US presidents of either party going forward. That said, Trump has very actively disparaged NATO before. He spent a good amount of time in his first term suggesting that the US leave, only be talked out of it by his then diplomatic and military advisors. So it's clearly not something he sees as a priority. Now, I'll just say as an aside that in its history since 1949, Article 5 of the NATO Charter has only been invoked once. And that was in September of 2001, when NATO voted to support the United States after it was attacked by Al-Qaeda terrorists. So it's the only time it's ever actually been implemented. Do I think that Trump would withdraw from NATO? I don't know. Like I said earlier, it's very clear that the US relationship with Europe is undergoing its most profound and dramatic changes since the onset of World War II. And because human beings, all of us, tend to have recency bias, it's easy once you get used to something happened in the recent past to assume that it will always be there. And now many of us think that it should, but in retrospect, it might be a little bit optimistic and perhaps even foolish on some of our parts to assume that just because it's been there for such a long time means that it always will. So finally, what does this mean as far as Taiwan? And what I will tell you is that the Taiwanese themselves, as well as our allies throughout the Pacific Rim, in Japan and South Korea and Indonesia and elsewhere, are very nervous about this. And they are very worried that if the United States were to walk away from its commitment to Ukraine, would they do the same thing in terms of Taiwan facing potential Chinese aggression? Many of Trump's advisors who counseled for a pullout from Ukraine have justified their position by saying we need to focus on the Pacific Rim because China, much more than Russia, is the challenge to which we should be paying the most attention. But I think many the other critics of the US position on Ukraine for the past 3 years simply want the United States to come home, not necessarily to shift from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but just the same isolationist tendencies that we saw after World War I and World War II, after Korea and Vietnam and 2 Iraq wars, we're seeing again in this country, in both parties. And so I don't know if Trump would actually withdraw from NATO, if he would condition US involvement on, as it relates to Article 5 in the way that he described. And I don't know if he would support Taiwan against Chinese aggression. I just know that there are many, many smart and very, very many worried people in both Europe and on the Pacific Rim who are asking the same questions and who don't have any answers. And one of the reasons we're seeing European leaders meeting so frantically to shore up their own defense infrastructure investments is because they don't know the answer to these questions.
Thank you. All right, we're going to keep it on foreign policy, and this question is asking, um, is it possible that the mineral deal that's hopefully to be in place between the U.S. and Ukraine, could that be considered coercion by Trump?
Um, it's a good question. My own opinion is not, if only because Zelensky was able to negotiate a more favorable agreement than the one that the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent originally offered to him on Trump's behalf. The original offer from the U.S. would have put Ukraine in very, very difficult economic circumstances for many, many years to come. While the agreement as it stood on Friday still probably advantages the US more than Ukraine, the fact that there were some back and forth negotiations suggests to me that while the US is certainly the strongest presence in these negotiations, I don't think the agreement itself represents coercion. Now, one of the things that'll be interesting to look back at in a week or a month or longer is whether the US's withdrawal of military support and intelligence capability that I talked about earlier to Ukraine might ultimately be considered coercion to force them to the bargaining table with Russia and with Putin. I don't know the answer to that, but I don't believe that the deal that was on the table to be signed on Friday might have been a better deal for the US than for Ukraine. But I think calling it coercion might go a little bit too far, given the fact that some negotiation did take place. One other thing I'll say quickly, if I can, Maddie, going back to our previous question, is I talked about many people, both in this country and elsewhere around the world, who believe in the importance of continued US military and diplomatic presence on both the Atlantic and the Pacific. What I should say, in the interest of fairness, is that there are plenty of people, the large majority of whom voted for Donald Trump, but not all of them, who believe that their country, the United States, has limited financial resources available. And particularly after a long war in Afghanistan and after the inflation and other economic difficulties that resulted from the COVID pandemic, that those resources simply ought to be spent in the US as opposed to other places in the world. These are two positions that have existed for as long as there's been a United States. And I think it's worth remembering as we go forward in this discussion that almost definitionally somebody who participates in events sponsored by an organization called the World Affairs Council Town Hall understands and respects the importance of a globalist approach by the United States, that roughly half of this country disagrees very vehemently.
Right. I'm gonna ask, we have another one here about still staying on topic about Ukraine. It's asking a little bit well about Trump as well, and saying that Trump's actions could be interpreted as favorable to Putin. And do you think that Zelensky should trust that U.S. military intelligence support will remain intact? Or I guess essentially asking, if you had to make a prediction about which way it's going to go, what would you put your bet on?
It does appear, both from these negotiations over the war and Trump's behavior since he first ran for president in 2016, suggests that he has a much stronger affinity for Putin than any of his predecessors of either party. So it's entirely reasonable for Zelensky and many others to assume that while Trump does want the war to end, he wouldn't be particularly troubled if it ended on terms that were more favorable to Russia than to Ukraine. Now, Trump's counterargument is he points to how belligerent Biden was in his comments about Putin over the last few years. And Trump says, well, where did that get us? By continuing to criticize Putin, we weren't able to make any progress in ending the war. So he says, what's wrong with talking to both sides? And Zelensky's concern and the concern of many people in this country, including many members of Trump's own Republican Party, is there's nothing wrong with talking to both sides. But if you are predisposed to offer a more favorable agreement to one than the other, that is a problem. And there is I think, a legitimate concern both in Europe and in this country that if Putin is able to settle with terms that allow him to keep a significant portion of the land in Ukraine that he has taken over, that his troops have taken over the last 3 years, that that peace treaty would be a temporary one. And at some point, he'd look to expand Russia's foothold further, not just into Ukraine, but in other parts of Europe. So I think talking to both sides and working with both sides is something that most reasonable people would agree. The question is, what are the terms of the agreement? And that goes back to the questions I brought up earlier when we were asked about the possibility of coercion.
Still see me? I'm sorry. For some reason, there we go. Okay, everyone can still see me. Disappeared from my screen for a second there, which is terrible timing because I have another great question about Ukraine and about this conversation that happened last Friday. And this one is actually, I guess, a little bit more about the interactions that happened. And it's wondering why you think there was such a focus of chastising Zelensky for his choice of attire in the White House, and what you think that might indicate.
Oh, really good question. So ever since the war broke out 3 years ago, Zelensky has dressed in all of his official and public appearances in some variation of Ukrainian military garb in order to show solidarity to the troops. Trump was clearly irked that Zelensky chose not to wear a suit and tie to the White House. Apparently, it had been communicated to the Ukrainian officials beforehand that Trump would like him to wear a suit. Zelensky obviously didn't. And so when Zelensky arrived, Trump made a fairly cutting remark about the way that Zelensky was dressed. And like I said, the two men don't like each other. And that goes back to Trump's first impeachment when he asked Zelensky to help acquire damaging information about Joe Biden. But clearly, the way Zelensky was dressed did get under his skin. I did hear at least one Trump critic note that Zelensky wasn't dressed all that differently than the way Elon Musk dresses when he goes to the White House. But regardless, these are two men with a lot of differences on a lot of points, including what appropriate dress is for a meeting between two presidents. And I certainly understand Zelensky's efforts over the years to demonstrate solidarity toward the men and women fighting on his country's behalf. And that clearly rubbed Trump the wrong way.
Thank you for answering that. You actually did touch on a few more questions that came in about comparing his attire to that of Elon Musk. So thank you for adding that in. All right, let's bring it home for these last couple questions. So just had a question that, and you mentioned earlier about isolationist Republicans, but this is saying isolationism isn't what it used to be. How isolationist can any nation be given how economically connected we all seem to be these days?
Well, it's a great question. The answer is, well, we can't be. Trump is working very hard, of course, to impose greater tariffs on imports from other countries, even at the potential cost of increase prices here. But it's important to know that Trump is not alone in this. And again, as you noted, this is not a partisan issue. If you go back to 2012, when Mitt Romney ran against Barack Obama, both candidates supported a sweeping trade agreement with countries throughout Asia called the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. By 2016, Donald Trump opposed it. So did Hillary Clinton. By 2020, Donald Trump still opposed it. And Joe Biden, who had been Barack Obama's vice president, who had supported the agreement 8 years earlier, opposed it too. So I don't want to fixate too much on this one proposed treaty. But the sentiment in this country is that if we pull back, the thinking is, and instead encourage more American manufacturing, that'll lead to more American jobs. The questioner is exactly right, though. In a world that is so intertwined, economically and in other ways, true isolationism is almost impossible, but it doesn't have to be absolute isolationism in order to have an economic impact. And for those of us, most of us, who learned about the Smoot-Hawley Act in high school and learned how those restrictions trade policies led to the Great Depression, it is a little bit jarring to hear this conversation come up the way it has. But in fairness, there's a lot of people who were skeptics of free trade in the late 20th century who pointed out the damage it did to many working class Americans. So once again, I would imagine that those of us who participate in a program sponsored by the World Affairs Council Town Hall, that we're more inclined to think internationally. But it's important to recognize, whether we agree with the opinions or not, that large portions of this country feel very strongly in the other direction.
Thank you so much, Dan. I don't think we've got time for any more, but I will say that if you would like to join us on our member session, please become a member. We have a great time over there. We'd really love to have you to ask more questions.
We sure would.
Well, Dan, thank you so much. This has been a terrific session. I think you and Madison probably would agree with me. I think the questions that the audience has asked, the great questions they've asked, indicate that there's a great level of uncertainty and unpredictability that's causing a lot of stress all the way around. But I have to say, your analysis and your insights help us to organize our thinking about these issues, and it's enormously helpful for me personally, and I'm sure for our audience. So I want to thank you very much for doing that. For our audience members, thank you very much for being with us tonight. If you didn't get your question answered, as Madison just said, there's a members only session after this. So if you're not a member, please join, and because Dan will be answering your question, and it's a real benefit for our members. I do want to thank Madison Alt for being the host tonight, and you didn't see Krista Seitz behind the curtain there, but she's monitoring the questions and all the polling there. So I thank you both. I thank all of you for joining us. Again, thanks to those of you who have donated in the past. If there's still a chance, just go to the chat there. There's a link to donate. Last plug here, but thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, especially Dan, for a great session. And to our members, see you on the other side of the members only session. Thank you all very much. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.